welcome back to A Journey with Ney. I am recording my second podcast with my second guest, and I am interviewing Fiona today. Fiona, how are you feeling?
I'm good, good.
So tell me about your story.
So, I guess beginning at the beginning. I was born in Greece, but my father's from America. He's from New Mexico. My mom's Greek. So I've kind of grown up in the in-between. I've grown up kind of in the Greek environment, but also very much out of it because I also went to international school. And it was this question of belonging. Where do I belong? And do I belong somewhere? And what is this whole feeling that I have that I don't quite gel here? I don't quite gel. There were my friends from the neighborhood who all went to the local school, which is and spoke Greek. And there were my friends from my school, who all spoke English. And it was a very different energy and a very different feel. And even though I have very strong, loving connections to both, I never really felt like I fully landed in either one of these groups. And the truth is that I never really landed that well in my home environment either. I grew up with quite a turbulent family setup. There was a lot of fighting between my parents and my kind of main masculine and feminine archetypal figures. So that was a big contributor to a kind of feeling of not unrest, but looking for something more. I was always looking for something more. I always knew that this wasn't the way that I really wanted to be living. It wasn't really it didn't feel like home that much.
Yeah.
So I guess that was the beginning of a journey. And don't get me wrong, I dearly love my parents. I dearly love my family. I also have a brother I dearly love. But it just showed me what I didn't want very clearly. And I was searching. I was definitely a seeker at that time. I was definitely searching outside of myself. And who knows, maybe that was exactly the right thing because it set me off on a journey. And even though throughout my school years I was very into art, I was very actively expressing myself through art, and I still do. I wanted to continue to do that, but I somehow switched paths and I chose to study psychology. And I had a real longing to understand why. Why were things the way they were? Why did people do the things they did? Why? Why was I the way I was? And I always had that question of who am I? My dad kind of introduced that at quite a young age, of that being the biggest question that could ever be. Now I kind of have come to realize that that's not really my question. But I am grateful for that. I always had a knowing. I always knew that the way we live in cities, in this society that we've created, or that we've entered into a lot of the time, is not actually in line with nature. It's not in line with nature's principles. It's not in line with the planet. It's not in line with our bodies and what we need, particularly our female bodies. I think that, it's been amazing being in this body and really feeling a friction from the inside and the outside. I had the privilege of spending every summer out of the city. And so I spoke to you a little bit about this before. So this sense, we went to an island called Alonisos, and that island is like traveling 50 to 100 years back in time. And Greece in general might be a little bit behind the UK and the US, but this place was like, wow, I can actually slow down here. And like I told you, it brought up a different part of me. And it was this much wilder, more primal, but also more free and natural version of myself. It felt like I could really express, I could really be in my body way that I couldn't when I was in the city. And I don't know if it's my particular design or my particular way of being, but my environment plays a massive role in how I come through and how I can also tap into myself. So that was amazing. Spending 3 months every year out of that city context, but then going back into it, the volume in the dissonance really switched up. And so I could really see it was a fight. It was a big fight for me going back to school, coming back into a small apartment when before I had the freedom to roam. We had a little tiny cottage, but I was like out in the field, the environment, the beach. I was out with my friends, and yeah, it was just so different. And it felt a lot healthier being in the village than it felt being in the city. And Athens is a big city, is, like that noise, clutter, you see everything is very squished together. We don't have much space to really breathe a lot of the time. So I was seeking a lot to leave the city. And so when the first opportunity came with one of my very first boyfriends, I was 17, and he was like, let's go on this beach. Let's go live on this beach for a few weeks. I was like, yes, let's do it 100%. So we camped out. It was a beautiful, beautiful beach on the island of Koufonisi. Just crystalline waters, sleeping under the stars, directly on the sand. And there was a community of other people that would meet every summer there. It's like, wow, this is it. In my 17-year-old self, I was like, I found the way I want to live, right? Of course, this is, it's different making that a reality. And, obviously the seasons change, but it left a lasting imprint. I think the land activated me, to be honest. I think the land really spoke to a part of myself that, like, a seed was planted or it was watered, a seed that was already there. And something really, really strong took hold. And I was like, I need to find a way to reconnect with myself, even if I can't be back in that place. Because particularly when I came back out of that, it was as if I was literally entering a different world back into the city. So that seed came with me. It's still with me today. But it did get covered over a few times. As it happens, as we go through our journeys, we take tangents that seem unrelated, but actually are very important parts of the journey itself. And so one of those tangents took me to Glasgow, and I arrived to study psychology. I realized very quickly it was not for me. Yeah. I was that seeking for understanding, seeking to find some insight into myself and into other people. It was not coming through the lectures I was attending. It was coming through my lived experience and the people I was in contact with, and the stories I would hear, and the questions that would rise up in me to ask them. And like just aha moments when I would hear someone's story of like, right, that really touches deep, and that maybe that's why this other person did that. It's just like a little network unfolding. And I definitely, I explored a lot with my party lifestyle, and it was just like kind of going wild in that direction. And at the same time, I used to be a smoker then, so I would smoke a lot, and it was really unhealthy. Even though a part of me was really stepping into herself, it was at the detriment of my whole being. And had an experience with mushroom, with a psychedelic medicine, that I heard as clear as day the voice of what felt like God, but it was coming through as the voice of David Attenborough at the time. Being like, girl, what are you doing to yourself? You need to get your shit together and stop self-destructing in order to feel something. You have everything you need inside of you right now. So stop. Otherwise, it's not going to end well. So it was like a big warning, and it shook me. I was like going down the tangent of doubting what I had known and what I had heard, and then being like, actually, no, this is a big wake-up call. And around the same time, I started going to a drumming class in the church. And so in the same room that my class was in, there was a Tai Chi class right before it. And the man who's now my partner was in that class. And so I would see him every week, just kind of clocked him and we clocked each other, and there was something there, but obviously we were strangers. So that was happening. And I was also at the time going to a tea shop called Chayovna, which is like it was a hub for meeting new people, basically, and kind of, yeah, that sort of thing. And I went there and I saw that he worked there. And so I was like, oh, hi, all of this, and really curious. Who is this guy? Right? There was just something deep in me that was like really drawn to him, but not in a way that I'd experienced before. It wasn't a lightning bolt. It wasn't an arrow through the heart. It was a recognition. It was like, I know you, but I don't know how I know you. And something was, because in many other times that I've fallen in love, it's very much an out of body experience. So this was totally new to me. I wasn't out of my body. I was really here. And my whole system calmed down rather than having this excitement like that. There was excitement, but it wasn't the same as other times. And parallel to this, while I've been going to my lectures and learning all of these things, I stumbled upon Carl Jung and the mythic psychology, the archetypal psychology, the more creative side of psychology. And this was only touched upon in the lectures, and I would go back to my wee room and I would like spend the rest of the evening listening to YouTube videos on all this stuff and just going into myth as a way to map out our journeys and how to creatively really not even create them, but just find the thread of meaning throughout my life. And that just kind of started happening. And I started doing some dream work, and I started really learning about how to work in ceremony. Like, how does this happen? I watched this video about Carl Jung going to visit the Native American village and witnessing their ceremony and being really like, wow, this is how you're supposed to enter into an altered state. This is how people have done it for millennia. It's not a recreational thing. It's actually something with a very deep, sacred purpose. Dare I say the word sacred, but yeah. And that for me found a depth that I hadn't put together before. So one thing led to another, and I was sat at that tea shop actually one day, and across from me was this really mystical looking older lady. And she was reading this book about Carl Jung, and I started asking her about it. She was like, oh, this and that, and we really got into it. And I'm like, but yeah, what about this mystical experience? What about these ways of working with plants and working with spirit? She was like, oh, you're talking to the wrong person. You need to talk to this guy. And guess who this guy was? Oh, David. And so we just sat down and started talking. He was on his break. And so, like, we didn't stop talking his whole break. And then we just arranged to meet up. And yeah, it's been a long journey since. After a certain amount of months, we got together, obviously, kind of right away. We knew. And he was helping to guide a series of ceremonies using plant medicine and working in that, in that way of honoring people and the plants and the time and the space in a way that felt really good. And so I was like, I'm going to experience this. And so I went along, and it was like, it was like I knew that place, but I could really experience the full spectrum of my own experience, if that even makes sense, because that space was held in a certain way. I could really unfold into myself in that moment because not only it felt safe, but it felt right. These things are always a bit tricky to describe, but it felt like a part of myself returned home. Because I was going almost every month. I felt like there was something there for me that I needed to, that I hadn't quite got yet. Again, this seeking, this external seeking. It was a very dissociating experience. One of the times, and I felt like I really needed help. And a big part of me hates asking for help, but I asked for help, and I don't know how it happened. Just through that intuitive sense, David and one of our friends sat on either side of me, and I could really feel their presence like an anchor. Whereas I was just like all in everything. I couldn't find myself. And that was the core of it, is that I kept looking out because I couldn't really feel myself. I didn't know where I was. I wasn't in my body most of the time, but I didn't even know it. And the moment they sat down, I know the various, energetic things happened, but I felt myself, and I could see myself as this spinning spiral of light coming back and lining up into my body and touching the ground, touching the earth through my body. And I just knew this to be my essence. And so that was the first time I really felt what it felt like to be in my body. And it was incredible. It was really like, I never forgot that. And after that, that led me on to wanting to train in somatic body work, restorative yoga, restorative somatics, because I felt the importance of grounding ourselves into our physical bodies. And and I just trusted that, it was the next right thing. And then that's been the way I've lived my life, actually, is not really making big plans, but feeling into the next right thing, step by step by step. And it does spiral and turn around. And soon after that kind of chapter, I became pregnant with my first child, and I started working with cacao as a medicine as well through my friend Anu, who, she's just amazing. She's a trailblazer in all these kind of things that are now becoming very popular. She was the OG in my world anyway. At this point, me and David were helping to hold the space as well. We stopped that and just really surrendered fully to life. Like, what we just knew, whatever was meant for us would not go by us, like that famous saying. And I taught for a while. And I worked at that tea shop for a while. I also worked as a cleaner for a while. It was just finding ways to support ourselves while we did the work that we knew we needed to do. And then after a while, I realized, actually, we need to be all in. We need to fully focus and not spread ourselves thin. And there is enough of that to live on. We just dove in, had our second child at that point, and just kind of been doing that since. And now we've just had our third as well 6 months ago. So
first thing that came up for me as you were talking through your journey, and I hate to interrupt journeys as well, it's just really interesting to hear where you feel your story has gone and is still going. You talked about David and the fact that you were still drawn to him, and it wasn't that incredible electric bolt. Like, I had tears in my eyes. For me, that resounded like so strongly because when I was younger, I thought that, as many people do as well, that when they meet someone, everyone talks about this massive spark and you've got to hold on to that spark. And I've seen podcasts before where people have spoken about that being anxiety. So, whereas for me, when I met Jordan, my husband, it was very similar. Like, it was that I knew him from another reality, from another plane, from another life. And I remember, I think it was our third date, and I was visiting him. He lived down in London, and I'd gotten onto the train. And just very naturally, without me even realizing, I said, "Love you, bye." And, and the doors closed. and, and I had this moment of, oh my gosh, what did I just say? Like, and I felt like it was my soul speaking through me. And I remember calling my friend and being like, well, like this is crazy. I've known this guy for a very short period of time. I now just told him I loved him. The door's closed. He's never going to speak to me again. It was really interesting to hear as well from when you were younger, and you spoke about Fiona off the beach and Fiona of the city. Did you sandwich them back together, or were they two separate personas that you kept at the beach and the city?
So that's a great question. It was summer Fiona and winter Fiona. They were so separate. Like, summer Fiona was wild. Like, she was running, doing her thing. And winter Fiona was very reserved, inward, like extrovert, introvert. When I came to Scotland, actually, I think that's when they began to not necessarily knit together, but both tempered to the point where they could coexist. And when I would go into my lectures, it was winter Fiona. And when I would come back home and do my own thing, it was summer Fiona. I always kept journals. I would make art. I would draw and I would write, and I would write poetry, and I would just write about parts of my day that stuck out and make little sketches. And also I would draw my dreams. And I could really tell when I was tapping into that one side of myself, because all of this was really unconscious, right? It was just the way I would present myself, but I was aware that it was different. And I wasn't trying to change it. I mean, I would try and change myself sometimes to fit into like a lecture space, obviously, where I would need to behave in a certain way, or when I was working for somebody else. And that was a big part of me wanting to leave being employed. I wanted to be self-employed. And that was a big change as well. My art was very, so when I would draw a face, one side of the face never matched the other side. When I drew the eyes, one eye would almost always be another color than the other eye, or a different pattern, or something would be very different. So I started to notice this and kind of draw in these elements of the Jungian psychology and the archetypal psychology, and see what was the message. I felt like I was trying to give myself a message here. What was going on. And that was, I think it was part of the extreme difference of the summer and winter for me, but it was also a mirroring of my mother and my father in many ways. It was like my masculine and my feminine were very split. And this is another element that I recognized later. I have a scoliosis in my spine, which is a curvature and a spiraling. But the spine is not pretty much straight up and down like a column, but it turns to one side and then turns to another. And I realized after some study and listening to this amazing woman called Liz Koch, who studies the psoas muscle, It's considered to be the muscle of the soul. It connects the upper body to the lower body. So it's a kind of bridge. It can be seen as a bridge between the upper world and the lower world, in many ways. Or also the masculine and the feminine. So her idea was that at a young age, particularly scoliosis as prevalence in women and in girls, and it particularly shows up around adolescence or pre-adolescence. And so her understanding is that one side of the body holds much more tension, and it begins at the psoas. And I personally found this to be true for myself. I'm not speaking for everyone, obviously, but it was very interesting to hear this idea. And also in traditional Chinese medicine, there's the idea that our one side of our body corresponds to the feminine and one to the masculine. We see this also in right brain, left brain kind of ideology. But she was saying that when there is a conflict, a very strong conflict or an unconscious conflict between the mother and father, then particularly girls tend to internalize that conflict since they can't resolve it or it seems unresolvable on the outside. We tend to internalize that and hold that tension almost as an inner mapping of our external world. And so it made a lot of sense to me, and it actually helped me to be at peace with it because I realized I was trying to fix it. I was trying to fix it, and that was just adding more tension to it. And what would happen if I just listened instead? What if I stopped trying to manipulate myself? What if I stopped trying to make my body do something other than what its own wisdom was already doing? And I realized actually this curvature has never stopped me from doing anything in my life. It's not necessarily added something, but if anything, it's added an awareness to all of this stuff. And so I began to lean in with my awareness to that, whatever was happening, that spiraling. It felt more like a spiraling than a curving. And yeah, it's led to a beautiful practice of unwinding the fascia around my psoas, my spine, and my whole body, which I don't know if I'd have discovered otherwise. But I guess what really began to bring these two sides of me together was birth. It was pregnancy, and it was also cacao. I have to give so much thanks to the medicine of cacao for this because it really allowed me to soften into my feminine nature and recognize that it doesn't have to be either or. It can be this and that. Because I do love my masculine nature. I do love my logical thought, and I do love, critical thinking, and I do love engaging myself in that way. And I love my feminine nature. I love my totally, unconscious depths. I love the creativity that comes through there. And I love the freedom and the capacity to express myself emotionally and to do all these things and to receive from that place.
It really resonates with me as well. The whole reason I went to the retreat was because I was so deep in my masculine. I realized as well that so many women are so deep in their masculine and they don't even realize it, especially in the corporate world. And for me, it was understanding that I could be more. I could dive into my feminine. I didn't think that emotions were a weakness or a vulnerability anymore, and I just allowed myself to cry when I wanted to cry. It's just really interesting that opened up because cacao obviously opens up your heart space. And talking about cacao as well. So for anyone who doesn't know what cacao is, what is cacao?
Yeah, so cacao is the the very raw material that chocolate is made from. So it comes from a tree, it comes from a bean, and it is inside this big kind of hollow sounding a little bit, or like dull sounding when you wrap on the outside of it. It's a big pod. It has many cacao seeds inside, or cacao beans inside. And what happens through a process of drying and slight fermentation, sometimes roasting, sometimes not. This bean is ground into a paste, and this paste is called a liquor, and then this is usually packed in blocks. That becomes like a really hard brick, and sometimes this is then further processed into a powder. So the fat is extracted, a powder, and the cocoa butter, what we know as cocoa butter. Okay. And then this is then reconstituted in order to make most chocolates. Okay. So there's an interesting pulling apart and coming together in industrial chocolate, but there's been this resurgence of cacao before it's been very processed in that way. There's, of course, some processing, but when we make a drink out of this, some people think that we need to adhere very closely to what is seen as a traditional way of taking cacao. Some people say that there isn't really a strong tradition of taking cacao necessarily in any one way. In terms of ceremony, particularly, some people say that actually it wasn't used ceremonially, it was used as a recreational drink. Okay. In societies such as the Maya, which is the most known for the cocoa bean. Beans were used as currency back then. So like a coin was of great value, but it wasn't necessarily taking the form of a ceremony that we might see today.
What happens at that point that you drink it? Like, how does it open up your heart space? How do you connect?
Just a brief note that, plant milk is what most people put in, like to use it as a solvent for it. But I have been drinking it with raw milk, raw cow's milk. Okay. And I've had the exact same effect, no ill effects from that. I wouldn't necessarily have it with pasteurized milk. Okay. But I think there is a lot of dogma around how one should prepare cacao. And I really want to challenge that because my experience is very different. And what I encourage people is to find their own way, to break the rules, because the rules tend to really sometimes hold us back from really connecting with the plant or really connecting with animal medicine. When we think that there's something that we shouldn't cross for fear of pissing someone off, I think that holds us back unnecessarily from our own authenticity. And that's a shame. It's a real shame. But that aside, what actually happens is that when you begin to imbibe or drink the cacao, your taste buds are activated. So your senses begin to be awakened. And as your body takes in the physical drink of cacao, as well as the plant spirit, which all plants have, of course, the spirit element is said to be particularly strong because it has not been separated, it's not been extracted and then put back together. Okay. It still has the whole essence of the plant. So it is a heart medicine. So what the physical effects of this are is that it heightens your heart rate. It opens and expands your blood vessels. It expands also the blood vessels in the lungs, which oxygenate the blood. And you might find yourself taking deeper breaths or noticing that you're noticing your breath a bit more. And it contains certain chemicals, like natural chemicals such as anandamide and theobromine, theobromine literally translates to food of the gods. And both of these chemicals are associated with feelings of joy, of bliss, of expansiveness, of letting down our preconceived kind of boundaries and just really letting ourselves be bright. So it has this innate capacity, though it might not always come on in that way. And it has a diuretic effect as well. So it has a clearing and cleansing effect. So all of these put together, so you might find yourself sweating or like wanting to pee more, or sometimes even emptying your bowels if you have a lot of it, very big dose. And sometimes it can have a really strong effect on the liver. So it helps that natural detoxification that the liver does anyway. So it just accelerates. So it's really, I love cacao for overcoming patterns that are unhelpful, patterns that have been there for too long and are just kind of not really serving us anymore. They're just there because we keep doing the same thing again and again, or we keep thinking the same thing again and again, or we keep moving in the same ways. So it's multi-layered, it's multi-dimensional. And it creates a beautiful opening for something new. Okay. For a new experience, a new cycle, a new pattern, a new way of looking at ourselves.
And you can take it daily, or would you like whenever?
It depends on the person. So I would really, if you want to work with cacao, I'd really recommend finding ways to drop in to yourself and your sense and body, and letting that be your guide, because anything prescriptive is external. What's really going on is you're in communication, you're in relationship with another entity, really, with cacao as a medicine. And when you're in that relational state, you really need to be in your own seat, not taking instruction from someone else.
I think that's one of the things that resonated from your story, that you had spent so much time seeking external validation, as many of us do. When you people please, or you don't listen to yourself as much, and really trying to listen to your body. So that's definitely something that I'm trying to do more of. And it's so amazing to hear that you had that experience, like understanding so early on in your life that you've had this such a like great time to really listen to yourself and what you want. And that cacao allows you to open that relationship up, because, and this has been so interesting for me, because I don't think I've properly understood cacao. So I've tried it a couple of times. I've made it in the morning, I put some spices in it. I made the mistake once of doing it with pasteurized milk, and I was like, this isn't so bad. And then everyone was like, no, you're not supposed to do it with milk. I was like, okay. Changed it with water, cardamom, clove, and I don't think I've actually sat down with it and properly given it the respect that you just spoke about. So I think that's something that I really want to do now, is to really listen and to kind of form that connection with that plant entity, and really think about how I feel and how it's feeling within me. So that's something new for me. So thank you. And I think you talked about ceremonial tea. So do you want to touch a little bit about what that is?
So I've worked with ayahuasca as a plant medicine again, and this is there's various variations of the actual plants that are used, but there is an actual plant called ayahuasca. The tea that I've worked with was not all the time ayahuasca. So there's usually two different components that are blended together. And the way that this came about in the jungle without microbiological knowledge, the way that we know scientifically, is absolutely amazing. It's complete spirit medicine, because I guess people are just so in that world already of communing with their environment as a living being, receiving information, giving information constantly, that they would know that this specific plant and this specific root combined together produce this specific effect that is so incredible, so intense, it's called the vine of the dead, because it does bring you into that connection with beyond this, the five senses, I guess, or this material reality, or whatever we want to call it. So it was like an apprenticeship. It's like an apprenticeship with working very intense plant medicine. It was a lesson in respect, absolutely 100% for plant spirit, the spirit world in general. It was an introduction into what some people might call a shamanic way or shamanic practice of journeying, of entering into an altered state, visionary state usually, but not always, sometimes auditory, sometimes pure direct knowing state. For me, it was always very visual. But the ultimate lesson from that time was returning to the body, bring everything back to the here and now. Otherwise, you're just off out there living an adventure that's not really connected to this world. And we are actually here right now for a reason. And that was massive for me. And that really, it stopped me trying to look for that validation or that external influence all the time. I still do it, like very much so, but much less than before.
I completely understand that external validation. I craved it, and now I feel it less. But also, this is why they call it a journey. It's not something that you suddenly, you don't want all of the things that you've spent your whole life wanting, but you just realize that they don't have as high a level of importance in your life anymore. That doesn't mean that they're still not there, but you just start to realize that you can gain so much wisdom from yourself. And that's, yeah, that's something that obviously I'm starting to understand a bit more of. On from the ceremonial space, and you talked a bit about somatics, and you also talked about, was it
Psychosomatics.
Somatics. So the two of them.
Psyche is the way I connect to it is the Greek word psyche. And psyche means soul.
Okay.
But the way that Carl Jung referred to the psyche is the total of the unconscious and conscious elements of all of it, all of us. And psyche is like almost, it's the life force, it's the life energy, the way that he saw it. And so connecting that to somatics, to the body, soma, again in Greek, is the body, and somatics is anything pertaining to the body, letting the body be at the center almost of whatever we do. And I see it as this amazing vehicle. It is, and I love this term, it's an amazing piece of biospiritual technology. It's like literally, we are here through it. A way of understanding ourselves. It's a framework for understanding the way that we're built in a way, or the way that we interact with the world around us. And I'm something called a manifesting generator. We all have like these types.
Okay.
And that helped me understand that I'm meant to do many different things, and that's okay. And I've had many different versions of the work that I offer. So psychosomatics is one of those versions, one of those kind of incarnations of my work. And right now, I don't really have a name for it, but I guess it's mostly under Freya's Kitchen, the tallow, because I also make tallow and all that. But the somatics that I offered, and I'm going to begin to offer in the new year again, is based in a baseline awareness of being here. Okay. What is here? what am I feeling right now in my body? What senses are letting me know about the world on the outside and on the inside? Okay. And how can I relax into that as a container for whatever else is going on with me? And relaxation was a massive piece for me because I found it really difficult to relax in the beginning. I was just very alert, very aware. Mm-hmm. And it's a practice. You can get really good at relaxing. Mm-hmm. That's been massively helpful in all three of my births. That ability to down regulate anxiety or stress or fight or flight response. Of course, there is a place when fight or flight or freeze is very, very helpful. Mm-hmm. But in day-to-day life and in birth, it's actually counterproductive. Mm-hmm. And it eats up a lot of our energy. So learning to work with and not override, but create a space in which our systems can naturally settle. Mm-hmm. Is really the key of what I offer. And I don't really, so I don't necessarily use direct focus on that I offer. So I'm very much about creating an environment and creating a space mm-hmm. for those natural fight, flight, freeze responses to self-regulate. Yeah, these are all like quite buzz terms right now, but what that means is literally you're there with the feeling. You're present with whatever's showing up mm-hmm. until it changes. Okay. And it always changes. Mm-hmm. It always changes.
Especially in birth. I ended up having an elective C-section, but I did do a bit of hypnobirthing and I understood a little bit about the fight or flight response and how it could be triggered by anything. Mm-hmm. And I operated from such a place of fear that I was so worried that that was going to be triggered by a hospital environment that I would then end up needing surgical intervention. This is obviously a good place to talk about your home births and then leading into your free births. So firstly, how did you make the decision that you wanted a home birth? And what does that look like?
First of all, I just want to say that I think it's a very wise choice that you made going for an elective C-section. Mm-hmm. And overall, it was probably less traumatic than the exact scenario that you just described. Mm-hmm. Going in hoping for a natural birth in a hospital environment, unfortunately, is up to luck. Yeah. It's not guaranteed. Yeah. Why do we go into hospital? We go into hospital for an intervention. Mm-hmm. Coming back to the choice to home birth and then eventually free birth, that's exactly why as well, is because the option of going into the hospital for me was just not an option. Mm-hmm. Like I dislike, putting it mildly, I dislike being in a hospital. Mm-hmm. I'm not comfortable. I'm not relaxed when I go there. I completely associate it with something being wrong, mm-hmm. something going, something not working right. Yep. And I know in my bones that birth is not that. Yep. I know that we are built to birth, the vast majority. And I know that sometimes things do go wrong, so to speak. Don't go the way that we want them to go. Mm-hmm. But the choice to have a home birth and the choice to have a free birth came with a massive reclamation of responsibility. Mm-hmm. And being okay with knowing that I am the sole authority and the sole person responsible for my birth, mm-hmm. and the birth of my child. Mm-hmm. And that actually, even the home births that I had, they had a little bit of this handing over responsibility because there was a figure of authority in the room. Okay. Yeah. So your question was and how does that look with having midwives present and all of this? Thankfully, in Scotland, it was extremely easy for me. However, I was lucky, or so lucky, so to speak, to be in the kind of age group, to be within a certain parameters that this made it very easy for them to give me a green light to a home birth. And this again now doesn't sit well with me at all, because why would someone else need to give me a green light to birth my baby at home, or to do what I know is right with my body and for my child?
I think the question is, how have we gotten from centuries, millennia of birthing children at home by ourselves with our families to this very westernized medical intervention model? The answer is fear. The fear that there is death of mothers, the death of children, and really, I suppose it's an element of control as well, because as soon as you go for scans and you go for you suddenly have something wrong, then that intervention gets heavier, heavier. And 9 times out of 10, because it's someone who has a medical degree, we listen to them. And I think that's not always the right choice. But it's the sharing of information and understanding our bodies better that then allow you to make the decision that works best for you. And no one's saying that it's wrong to go to a hospital, because lots of people do that. But again, there's just a higher chance that there might be medical intervention. So, talking about the home birth, did you go for scans with the NHS? So you took it up to a point, and what were the conversations that you maybe had with the medical practitioners that you wanted to have a home birth, and how is that different from going to a community midwife unit and maybe having the safety net, as you will, of being in a hospital setting, but being in a more natural setting? And I say that in inverted commas. So
absolutely. So it was pretty easy. I just went through with my first. We went through the hoops, so to speak. So I told my GP, and he referred me to because it was a midwife led unit anyway there, and I spoke to the very first midwife right away, and I'm like, we want to go for a home birth. This is our mutual decision. My partner was really supportive, thankfully. Like, so grateful. He was my champion for all of this. And yeah.
This is a lot for a partner as well.
Absolutely.
And did you have pushback from the NHS?
Thankfully, not at all.
No.
And we were lucky enough to also be living in an area. We were in the West End of Glasgow, which was quite progressive, forward thinking, and okay with it. And they also had the number of, I think that was the very first home birth team in a long time in Glasgow. So we were lucky in that sense. But I'd also done a lot of reading, and I was ready, I was going in with the backup. Should I need to defend my position, I had certain things to say. And I went in with the knowing that I could decline anything that I did not want. So that first time, though, first times with anything are challenging, and like you've never encountered this before. So there's a little bit of like doubt. There can be, I guess, unless someone has a very ironclad resolve that, can I trust myself in this situation? Am I able to do this? And no one can answer that, because pregnancy is an entry point into the mystery. It's a massive rite of passage. It's a massive transformation that is happening in real time. I did lean on that, lending out that responsibility to a midwife being present. That was my what if was, what would happen if something happened to my baby during the birth. And I outsourced that responsibility. I didn't know it then, but it was there. And I knew the midwife throughout my pregnancy. It was pretty much going to be one of three midwives that I'd met. And, it just so happened that my son was born a couple of weeks before the assigned due date, which, as we know now, is very rarely accurate. It's the birthing season. I love that. Midwife arrived, but there was what's called a nuchal cord. So I don't know if we need to put like a trigger warning or anything, but my son had his umbilical cord wrapped around his neck, which I later found out is absolutely normal, and it's actually designed so the umbilical cord has something on it called Wharton's jelly, which is an extremely slippery covering, coating. So you can literally tie a knot in an umbilical cord and move the knot up and down. And the baby still receives their blood supply.
Instantaneously, I felt fear when you said that. So just that definition just makes it sound so much better. But again, you don't get that information.
No. And our midwife also felt the fear. Like, there was fear in the room. Right? So what happened was that she intervened and cut his cord before his body had emerged. And so there was a whole lot of unpacking that I had to do after that birth that taught me so much, basically. Now that I know, I would not allow this to happen again.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, as well as we've gone through the years, what's emerging is that when you think of birth, you think the first things you think are safety, baby, and people think that the best place environment for that is hospital, just because that's how we've grown up. If you say, I want to have birth in my house, whether it's with a midwife or without midwife, the fear, like, it's just, why would you do that? Why would you, have you thought this through? The risk element of it, but the risk element still is present in a hospital. And I think this is, as I'm starting to listen to stories from women, and it's not just the birth that's important, it's the experience for the mother around that. And also for the partner, because a lot of people forget about the partner, and they've just probably just had just as much kind of trauma than the mother has, so, and the baby. So I think it's really starting to push towards, or people are starting to think a little bit more about, how is this going to feel? And I'm obviously, you did your research, you had safety nets in place if you needed to utilize them. I mean, that's understandable. You would have done that. So, how did that feel from the first birth to the second home birth?
So I felt it was like a muscle memory. It was like a muscle memory for a lot of it, and I felt a lot more relaxed. I trusted myself a lot more, and I had actually, it was almost complete surrender from the moment of like knowing that I want to be pregnant, and all the way until that birth, and I guess beyond. But for that amount of time, I was like, I trust myself, I trust my life, I trust my baby, I trust whatever, whatever this amazing intelligence of nature that has brought me up until this point, guide me from here, and I'm listening. I'm co-creating this right now. So I was in that very surrendered, but like active surrender, not like slumped back surrender. It was like a engaged and present surrender. I surrendered to the things that were beyond my control. So the things that were within my control, such as training, eating well, keeping myself relatively in a relaxed, joyful state, not forcing myself, obviously, but avoiding those things that I knew would stress me out, that I knew were not in alignment with, this, because pregnancy does change our bodies. It does. We are a lot more open. But we're also more physically, I want to say we strengthen. We're carrying extra weight. So our bodies do strengthen, but potentially there's that potential for a natural building of strength. And I think there's a natural inclination for us to be more protective of our energetic space and our physical space and our bodies, which is why it's so devastating actually to hear some of the stories that we've all possibly heard about how birth gets hijacked, how we get coerced into things because we want to protect. Yeah. But yeah. So that second home birth was very straightforward. Like I had quite a big tear the first time around. The second time around, I barely had any such thing. And it was amazing to just be at home and just be able to feed my baby right away, lie down, have something to eat. My mom was there at the time. She wasn't there for the actual birth, but she came with my mother-in-law and she brought food, and just it was like a little party afterwards. It was lovely, like a very calm party. And I just went and had a nap with the baby, and just really, I was like really, really grateful for that opportunity. And then the midwives the second time around were extremely hands off. Like they literally sat in a different room. They had a cup of tea. I needed my own space. Okay. And they literally just came through when baby was ready to come out. Okay. So, and that was very helpful, actually. I hadn't met those midwives either. I had just trusted that the exact midwives that need to be there are going to be there. Yeah. And they totally were. They guided me to just breathe and to come back, because I think there was a moment of like being really out. I was in a very meditative state throughout the whole thing, but I kind of came out just as my daughter was about to be born. They guided me back in, guided me to my breath, and I actually experienced what they call a fetal ejection reflex, which is just the natural release of the body expelling the baby. That was that, really. Was your son present during birth? No. And then with your third baby, you had a free birth. So what kind of made you change your mind from the home birth to the free birth where no one is present for you and your partner? There was just a real knowing. It was almost like a natural progression for us of each birth. Like, I guess that second birth, really, we realized we could have done it ourselves. There was really nothing that the midwives offered us, and throughout that time, I became aware of, there's a podcast called the Free Birth Society podcast, and I was listening to lots of other women's stories of their own free births, and also was educating myself on what exactly, why is it that so many births end up in the hospital or are planned to be in the hospital, or I also was aware that many home births ended up transferring to hospital. And I realized actually how deep that rabbit hole goes in terms of what a midwife is allowed and not allowed to do. And what is the framework that a midwife is required to work within. Why, why, and all of this. And it turns out that because of the time frames, the legality is that a midwife can't be at a birth for longer than a certain amount of time. So this then limits the capacity that that a home birth can go on for us.
Right. Okay.
So it's nothing to do really with the mother necessarily. Mm-hmm. It's also to do with this externally imposed framework. Mm-hmm. I was like, this is not really built to support the mother. Mm-hmm. It's up to a certain point. Mm-hmm. And then there were various other things like that that I didn't want to bring into my space. I didn't want to have a time limit. I didn't want to have another person there that was going to be constrained and then bring that constricting factor into the energy of the room or energy of the space. Mm-hmm. And I was curious, what would happen? How would it go without that externally imposed framework? Yeah, I educated myself a lot. I spent like all those 9 months really diving deep into birth physiology. What are the mechanics? What happens? How are we designed for that process to happen? Not even optimally, but for it just to happen. Mm-hmm. And what is it that stops that process from happening? And it's not just biomechanics, it's also biochemical. What are the hormones that are released? And there is a very, very intelligent cascade of hormones that, I can't remember the exact details of it, like the names of each hormone just now, but it was like massive realization that, wow, this is actually precisely designed so that oxytocin and adrenaline work in precise timings as the baby is making their way through birth canal in order for, this whole process to just happen, to just unfold. And the more I was able to trust in that kind of wisdom.
And with the free birth stories that you were listening to, was there more positive stories than negative stories? Because I find with just just having a conversation with a woman who's had a baby, 9 times out of 10 they're going to tell you a bad story, and then that just kind of amplifies the fear that is around a lot of the births. So with the free births, like, were people more positive about things?
Yeah, in general, I think it's not that there was never a negative story, but it was the way that it was approached. It was the sense of that self-responsibility, but also the courage to examine that what if, to really look at it like, yeah, what if I die? What if baby is born and not responsive? And it turns out that actually a lot of babies are born non-responsive, but it takes them up to, however long it takes, like some births, even 10 minutes, while the placenta is still attached, supplying baby with oxygen. The baby's not actively using their lungs. And I'm like, that's so interesting. What if we're allowed to take our time? What if there's no rush necessarily, unless the mother in that moment, because there's such a delicate connection. Like, I remember when my son that was born just like 6 months ago as well, but it was like I noticed a part of myself being so aware, so awake, and so like I was taking him in. I was completely, my eyes, my whole being was assessing in real time what was going on. I just knew. He didn't cry right away. He was awake and aware, but he wasn't vocalizing. I think some people might get freaked out by that, but I was like, he's absolutely fine. He's amazing. He's wonderful.
It sounds like such an empowering moment.
Yeah.
It's amazing to hear as well. Like, my birthing experience was the absolute opposite. So I opted. So I had gestational diabetes I was diagnosed at about 17 weeks. I was consultant led, and instantaneously, as soon as they offered an elective C-section, I jumped, because I couldn't control what was happening. I hadn't imbued myself with knowledge. I just didn't understand what the process was, how much power I could have in that process. And I had the elective section, and at the time, I just remember my son coming out and being brought around the curtain, and me thinking, what is that? I had there was such a disconnect, such a massive disconnect, because obviously they were pumping me full of artificial oxytocin, and they brought him round, and I just remember feeling fear that I was going to drop him, because obviously I was so full of so much stuff, and not feeling that real connection, and knowing I'm not entirely sure if I'm going to be blessed with a second child, or if we even want to have a second child. But I know in my bones that I would try everything that I could to have a natural birth, and to have those conversations with the consultants and push back and use my voice and use the knowledge that I would be learning at the time over my pregnancy, to really have that connecting moment of that birth. And that's even more exemplified by having a free birth or having a home birth, in such a safe space as well for you. So yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's just, yeah, it's really, let's talk about what you mean by womb work, because I'm very intrigued as to what that means.
So womb work can mean so many different things, right? And each practitioner, I'm sure, has their own way of working with it. But I bring in my somatic bodywork training for this. So the womb is an intelligent space. It's an intelligent, almost like a being, but it's like the part of us that knows, right? It's almost like we connect to not just our power, but to a very primal part of ourselves that is extremely wise. And beyond the physical space of the womb, there is the energetic space of the womb. And that's what I really love to work with. And that as a birther, not just of people, children, but of dreams, of creativity, of anything that we want to bring through, from our vision, from our knowing, from inspiration into physical reality. Mm-hmm. So the somatic work that I have been trained in is, it used to be called Tansu, which is tantric shiatsu. Mm-hmm. Tantric, not in like a modern sense, but as in the principle of masculine, feminine, receptivity, action, and that pure being with what is men. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot there. There's a lot that I can dive into, but just a brief overview of that. Mm-hmm. And shiatsu, it was a Zen approach to shiatsu, mm-hmm. which is, I don't work with specific pressure points. I work with energy streams. So, and particularly with grounding pressure. Mm-hmm. So it's I will work with specific streams connecting to the womb, but I'm not interested in manipulating that energy. Mm-hmm. All I'm there to do is to guide that energy into connecting with the support beneath it by bringing a little bit of my body weight onto and creating pressure over streams in the legs, for example, or the streams in the or the arms. And bringing that as a containment for the energy of the womb to do and be exactly as it needs to do and be.
Okay.
So without us dampening its voice or shutting it down, that's the most common, I'd say, was really not listening to the guidance of our own womb space.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, relating to our cycles and birth itself.
Okay.
That's how I'm beginning to work with it now. And what I'm beginning to create is an offering for closing the portal, closing that very open and expansive ness that happens during the birth process, however that is.
Mm-hmm.
And I include miscarriage and abortion or something like this, termination of pregnancy, in that as a birth as well. All of this is the same, it has the same blueprint, the same kind of pattern, or the same energy signature as birth.
It's such a beautiful offering because women don't talk enough about the sadness that accompanies miscarriages and abortion. So being able to help and close that space. Touching just on the phases of the cycle of menstruation.
I like to think of them as seasons, right? And there's some amazing work out there. The Red School is amazing as a resource. Uma Dinsmore-Tully, who has written an amazing book, a volume of wisdom, more through the yogic lens, called Yogi Shakti. There's amazing information on that. But the seasons, just as we get external seasons, we can also have these internal seasons, and these mirror the different ways that our these different parts of the cycles. It also varies according to each person, according to each cycle. So I am quite wary of giving these specific characteristics, but we have pre-ovulation, ovulation, premenstruation, and menstruation as the 4 seasons. So we can think of these as the spring, the pre-ovulation, the summer of ovulation, the autumn of premenstruation, and the wintertime menstruation. So likewise, as you might imagine, springtime has an upward moving energy. Ovulation can be seen as that peak-most point of that vital energy as the body literally prepares for the potential of creating new life. And then when this doesn't happen, then there's the breakdown with the downward moving energy of autumn, which prepares us to go down into the shedding phase of winter. And actually, it's really interesting because my personal experience is very different. Well, I haven't got my period back this time around yet. But before that, I would experience my ovulation as a very interning time, which is actually counter to what most people might see it as. And my winter time was very creative, very, very upbeat a lot of the time. I needed to rest, but I was very active in creating during that. So it's really interesting. And that's why I don't like to say, oh, summer is full of energy and you're full of vibrancy and you're always happy and like all of this. It might be like that sometimes and it might not. And
everyone's different.
Exactly.
But it's really interesting because I really do want to learn like how that works in my own cycle and to do more research into that, which I would definitely be interested in talking more about, because my husband always says there's like 2 weeks I'm happy, 2 weeks I'm just not. And to really understand what it is about that time frame so that I can then adjust my behavior accordingly, or just be a bit more mindful of what my triggers would be, and listen to myself as well, and give myself the space that I need within those time frames. So lastly, you are the tallow goddess from what I can see. You have a company called Freya's Kitchen. We need to obviously talk about tallow and what it is and what the benefits are.
Tallow is suet, which is the hard white fat that forms around the kidneys of a ruminant animal. And so that is extracted, and I chop that up and I pressure cook it multiple times, and I filter it and I remove any what we might call impurities, which is any tendon or fascia, things like this. And then I'm left with a pure white, almost odorless block of fat. And now tallow was used for forever until the 1900s, pretty much 1990s to be exact, when seed oils began to come to the forefront of both cooking and skincare. And that's quite a controversial kind of thing, because the history of it goes that when seed oils began to be advertised, they were actually advertised, and those adverts were funded by industrial lubricant companies that sold seed oils previously only as industrial lubricants. They were used to clean effectively machine parts. Okay. But I think as a movement towards growing this industry, they began to be marketed towards housewives and people like candle makers and things like this. So some might say that it wasn't exactly ethical for this to happen, for fats that were traditionally used without negative effects on health to be then replaced by things like canola oil, for example. That's the big one. And so there's a big example of the company Crisco, which used really, really sly marketing to appeal to things that they knew housewives would attach importance to. So that slowly took place of tallow and lard in cooking. And it's actually quite interesting to see how the marketing of this appealed towards odorlessness, cleanliness, and there was a general movement away from anything that was seen as old school. So this newfangled thing that was marketed in this way, also we see parallels of this in this movement away from the village, actually, from village life, from that connection to nature. And I think we're all wanting to go back to that. A big part of us wants to go back to that feeling of connectedness. You get bored of the new and shiny, and you want to go back to the old and reliable. Yeah. And how did you get into tallow? So that's a good wee story. So, my partner has always eaten a primal diet, or like a Paleolithic diet. So he eats vegetables, fruit, meat. At the moment, he's only eating fruit and meat and eggs and dairy. So he doesn't eat processed food at all, except for like butter. That's like the most processed thing he eats. And so I've been in that world through him very much, kind of researching and him telling me things and like showing me articles and studies around, how this way of living actually reverses a lot of disease and all of this. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then our friend, who is a deer stalker, brought home, like, she offered us to teach us how to butcher a deer and how to ethically harvest the meat from the animal. And that was a massive experience for all of us. And she brought a deer to our living room, and we sat and we literally learned how these traditional ways of processing the deer are. And that was the first time I, with my eyes, identified the tallow around the kidneys of that deer.
Right.
And particularly, deer tallow is actually very yellow. It's not white like beef tallow.
Okay.
So I harvested that and I made my first tallow balm. And I mixed this with mugwort. And mugwort is one of my very favorite plants to work with. Artemisia is the Latin name given to mugwort. And Artemis is the ancient Greek goddess most associated with deer. Deer was her sacred animal. And so I didn't even realize this at the time, but I put these two together and I was like, wow, there's like a real Artemis around this. And it was just really special. And after that, it's quite hard to get deer tallow all the time. So I experimented with beef tallow, and it was a lot more odorless as well. And so I started looking into it as an actual thing. And I found out that this was used as skincare for generations and generations until the 1990s. And you know, it was just what people had in their homes. They wouldn't actually make a cream necessarily. They would just take a bit of tallow that they would have for cooking and just apply it as needed. And then I started looking into it a bit more, like, why does my skin feel so good when I put it on, as a cream, as a balm? And tallow has very similar qualities to our own natural skin oil production.
Okay.
So it's not bioidentical, but it's very close to that structure. And so our skin recognizes this. It soaks it in, basically. It just takes it in. And at a very kind of primordial level, our skin is a boundary. And the job of our skin is to keep some things out and to take certain things in. And depending on what we've conditioned it to pick up on, a lot of the time we're used to putting lots of different things on our skin. And so we might not be as sensitive to what our skin is telling us as a messenger. Same with all of our senses. But as if we decide to rewild our senses a little bit and to decondition our sense of what feels good, what feels like home to our bodies.
It's really interesting because the skincare that my grandmother and like my mom would use, my grandmother used something called basin, which is gram flour. And she would then put a bit of water in, turn it into paste, gram chickpea flour, and then she would put it on her face. And she would just use that as an exfoliant. Skin is amazing. When I was younger, I was obviously putting so many things on my face, and when I got into my 20s, I ended up with acne because I used a beauty product that then caused my skin to break out. So I then had to really think about what I was putting on my skin. My sister-in-law, Cheryl, told me about tallow, and she uses it. My mother-in-law uses it. And having the conversation with you, and you mixing it with honey, and the properties of honey being very healing. It's been such a long time since I can go out and feel like confident about not wearing makeup. So it's been really transformative. So thank you for that. And I use it once a day. How would you recommend?
So again, feeling into what feels good for you, depending on kind of what kind of skin you've got as well, what type of skin. But I like to use it kind of all the time. Whenever I feel it extra dry, it just pops them on there, puts them on before bed and first thing in the morning. My skin is particularly dry in general, so especially around winter, I want a bit extra too. So yeah, I've just recorded a little video as well of a little face massage. So that'll be going on the little labels on the jars soon. It'll be great.
Oh, yes, your QR code.
Yeah.
What do you mix tallow with? And also as well, I've noticed that you do tallow for babies, so like and kind of nappy rash.
Yes.
So tell us a bit more about those two.
So that one is, I'm still tweaking that one a little bit because I have a completely neutral one without any herbs in it. So I use jojoba oil as just an extra little addition in there. It makes it a bit smoother, I think, in the application, and a bit of beeswax. So that is tallow, beeswax, and jojoba oil. That's my baby one at the moment. But I'm playing with putting a little bit of yarrow infused oil in there and chamomile just to help when there is extra irritation. Those two can be amazing for soothing, cooling that, because it is a heat, it is like that almost angry rash a lot of the time. Same with drool or dribble rash.
Yeah,
it works really well.
Yeah, I put tallow in Ari when he's got dribble rash, and it really helps. And the different types of tallow that you use.
So the different types of tallow, I have one with frankincense, myrrh, and rose. So all of my tallows are made with infused oils over essential oils at this time. I just find that they're much softer and more sensitive for the skin. Like they're essential oils. I love essential oils. I love the smell of them, but I find when I apply them daily to my face, it dries it out even more, and it's not very good for me. And they are very volatile, so they are reactive, and just it feels better to have something that's not as volatile daily on my skin. But these infused oils contain a bigger spectrum of what the plant has to offer us, whereas essential oils aren't actually oils. They are the volatile compounds that contain all of the aroma of the plant, but they don't necessarily contain the medicinal value of the whole plant.
Okay.
Essential oils are extracted from the plant usually by steam distillation, which gives you usually a tank of what we call floral water or plant water. Hydrosol is another name for them.
Okay.
And then a very thin layer of essential oil rests on the top of that. So a massive amount of plant matter is required to produce a very small amount of that essential oil. However, the hydrosol itself contains just as much and even more compounds in it than just that volatile oil.
Okay.
And it's similar when we infuse an oil. So it contains some of the essential oils. It might not extract all of the essential oil because of the lack of that heat, that steam heat, but it contains that wider spectrum.
I think what we've discovered from our chat today is that you are very multifaceted. Chameleon. Take a bit of everything, put it together, but in a way that really pulls in all the wisdom, and really also just listening to yourself, which I think is such a beautiful thing. Also, I think you described it in our conversations as being like a multifaceted diamond. And you had said that it was taking lots of different things but still being a whole, which I really loved. So thank you for the chat today. Want to share your socials as well so that you can tell everyone about everything that you provide.
Thank you so much. This was a joy.
Yeah, this was a pleasure. Your socials are?
So Fiona.Sears is my Instagram handle, and it's Freya's Kitchen. It's everything tallow. You'll find it on there. And yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you everyone as well for listening. If this resonates with you, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.